Mara learned early that invisibility was not the absence of presence, but the absence of acknowledgement. She existed in rooms long before the people who owned them entered, and long after they left. Her hands touched surfaces that reflected wealth: glass staircases, marble counters, chrome railings. Yet none of it ever reflected her back. The penthouses she cleaned were suspended above the city like private clouds, floating worlds sealed off from gravity and consequence. From their windows, the city looked decorative rather than inhabited, a collection of lights rather than lives. Mara arrived before sunrise most days. She preferred the hours when the buildings were quiet, when security guards nodded at her without curiosity and elevators obeyed without complaint. There was comfort in routines that did not require conversation. Her uniform was always clean, pressed by her own careful hands the night before. She had learned that when you are unseen, the smallest imperfection becomes an excuse for others to finally look, only to judge. She cleaned the Hale estate 3 times a week. It was not called a house. It was called a residence, a word that suggested permanence and intention. Set behind high walls and sculpted hedges, the estate sat on land large enough to forget the city existed at all. Even the air felt different there, filtered, conditioned, quieter. Cameras blinked from every corner like unblinking eyes that somehow never noticed her. Victor Hale rarely appeared. When he did, he moved through the space like someone passing through a hotel he owned but never intended to sleep in. Phone to ear, jaw tight, eyes already elsewhere. His voice carried authority without warmth, the kind that bent rooms around it. Staff members straightened when he passed, then relaxed once he was gone, as if gravity had temporarily increased. Mara never spoke to him. Not once. He did not know her name. His daughter, Lila, did. At least, Mara believed she did. Lila was 8 years old and small for her age, with a seriousness that didn't belong to children who had never known hunger or fear. She drifted through the estate like a ghost with permission, present, but unattended. Her shoes were always expensive, her clothes always clean, yet something about her felt unfinished, like a sentence no one bothered to complete. Mara noticed things others didn't. She noticed how Lila ate meals alone more often than not, seated at a table long enough for 12. How the child learned to lower her voice instinctively, as if the house itself might be disturbed by sound. How Lila watched adults carefully before speaking, as though measuring whether words were worth the effort. Nannies came and went. Some stayed weeks, others months. They arrived cheerful, armed with enthusiasm and rules, and left quietly, with resignation folded into their smiles. Tutors rotated too, each bringing new schedules, new expectations, new ways to correct a child who was never misbehaving to begin with. Affection was procedural, scheduled, replaceable. Mara watched all of it from the edges. She cleaned Lila's room while the child attended lessons elsewhere. She folded clothes that still held warmth from a body that had already moved on. She straightened stuffed animals that seemed to wait for something that never arrived. At first, Mara told herself she was simply observant. Then she realized she was jealous, not of the money, not of the estate, but of the assumption that Lila mattered, that if something went wrong, alarms would sound, that people would come running, that the world would pause. Mara's own childhood had taught her otherwise. She had grown up in a house where silence meant survival, not luxury, where being noticed usually preceded punishment. She learned to move quietly, to make herself useful, to occupy as little space as possible. By adulthood, it was second nature. Invisibility became safety. Safety became identity, until resentment found it. Resentment does not announce itself as evil. It disguises itself as clarity. Mara began telling herself stories while she worked. This child is lonely. This child is being neglected. Someone should do something. The stories felt righteous, necessary. They filled a hollow place inside her that no paycheck ever touched. In the far corner of the estate grounds stood a structure most visitors never noticed. It was tucked behind manicured trees and decorative fencing, blending into the landscape like an afterthought. The private kennel had been built for Victor Hale's former security dogs, animals that had long since been retired, sold, or relocated. The structure remained, climate-controlled, clean, quiet, mostly empty. Mara discovered it by accident one morning while following a maintenance checklist. One enclosure door didn't latch properly. She noted it in her report. No one fixed it. Days passed, then weeks. Opportunity is patient. It does not pressure. It waits for justification. Mara found herself standing there longer than necessary, her cleaning supplies forgotten at her feet. She imagined the space differently, not as what it was, but as what it could be. Safe, contained, temporary. She flinched at the thought and pushed it away. But the thought returned. Again and again. It followed her home, sat beside her during dinner, whispered during sleepless nights. Each time, it softened itself, reshaped its edges, until it no longer sounded like harm, but like intervention. Just for a moment. Just to prove a point. Just until someone notices. Mara did not recognize the danger because it wore the mask of purpose. And purpose, when starved long enough, becomes intoxicating. At first, Mara believed she was thinking in circles. She would catch herself standing still in the Hale kitchen, sponge hovering above a counter already clean, her mind replaying the same fragments, the same justifications, the same imagined outcomes. She told herself it was fatigue, the byproduct of long hours in quiet rooms. Everyone had intrusive thoughts, didn't they? Thoughts that arrived uninvited and left without consequence. But this one stayed. It learned the shape of her days. It waited for moments when her guard was down, when the house was empty, when Lila's footsteps echoed faintly down distant hallways, when the silence felt less like peace and more like neglect. The thought did not shout. It whispered. It asked questions instead of giving orders. What would happen if the child disappeared for a moment? Who would notice first? How long would it take before panic replaced indifference? Mara hated herself for wondering. She would scrub harder when the questions came, as if friction could erase them. She would repeat rules in her head, laws, morals, consequences. She reminded herself of prison walls she had never seen, but could imagine clearly enough. Yet the questions kept evolving. They became specific. She began noticing routines not out of curiosity, but out of pattern recognition. Lila's lessons started at 9. Lunch at noon. Walks in the garden only when a particular nanny was on duty. The days when Victor Hale was in the country versus abroad. The hours when security rotated shifts. Mara told herself she was only observing because observation had always kept her safe. But observation, once sharpened, can become preparation. The kennel appeared in her thoughts more frequently now, no longer an abstract place, but a concrete solution. It was quiet there, hidden, separate from the house. She had cleaned it thoroughly weeks ago, as part of a forgotten task list. She remembered the temperature control panel, the automatic water system, the padded flooring. She remembered how unused it felt. She told herself that mattered. At night, Mara lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling where cracks formed shapes she never bothered to name. She imagined different versions of herself, one who dismissed the thought entirely, one who confessed it to someone, one who quit her job and walked away from the estate forever. None of those versions felt real. What felt real was the pressure building in her chest, the sense that something was wrong and had been wrong for a long time. Not just with the Hales, with the world, with the way some lives were padded against consequence while others absorbed every blow. She did not think of herself as cruel. She thought of herself as corrective. The story she told herself became more polished, more convincing. The enclosure isn't a punishment. It's a pause. She won't be alone long. Nothing bad will happen. Mara avoided mirrors during this time. When she caught her reflection in glass walls or polished metal, she felt exposed, as if her face might betray her thoughts. She feared seeing excitement there, or worse, relief. Instead, she focused on the child. Lila had started talking to herself more often. Quiet monologues delivered to empty air. She pretended not to notice when Mara was nearby, but her eyes flicked toward her sometimes, curious rather than afraid. "Do you live here?" Lila asked one afternoon, as Mara dusted a bookshelf. Mara hesitated. "No, oh," Lila said, disappointed in a way that seemed too practiced. "Nobody really lives here." The words lodged in Mara's chest like a splinter. That night, the thought stopped feeling like an intrusion. It felt like an answer. The next day, everything aligned in ways that felt less like coincidence and more like permission. The nanny called in sick. A replacement arrived late. Security was distracted by a delivery issue at the main gate. Victor Hale was overseas. Mara moved through the house on autopilot, her body following routines while her mind raced ahead. She told herself she could still stop, that she would stop, that this was just another rehearsal of a thought she would never act on. She passed the kennel on her way back from the garden, her heart pounding harder than the situation seemed to require. The unlocked enclosure door swung slightly in the breeze. Mara closed it, opened it again, closed it. She stood there longer than necessary, breathing in air that smelled faintly of disinfectant and disuse. The space was not threatening. It was neutral, clean, waiting. She left. For an hour, she managed to return to her tasks. She vacuumed hallways. She wiped down surfaces. She answered a brief question from a supervisor with a voice that did not shake. Then she heard Lila laughing. It echoed from the wrong direction. The child had wandered again, curious and unguarded, drawn by the freedom that came from being overlooked. Mara saw her near the side path, crouched to examine something on the ground, absorbed in her own world. This was the moment when the thought should have died. This was the moment when reason should have asserted itself, when fear should have overridden impulse. Mara felt both rise within her, sharp and urgent. But another feeling rose too. Validation. The sense that fate had stepped aside and cleared a path. Mara's feet moved before her mind finished arguing. She spoke softly, calmly, used the voice that made children listen without questioning. She did not lie. She did not threaten. She guided. Lila followed. It happened faster than Mara had imagined and slower than she would ever forget. The sound of the gate closing was not loud, but it carried weight. It was final in a way nothing else in her life had ever been. Silence followed. And in that silence, the thought finally revealed itself, not as justice, not as purpose, but as what it had always been. A mistake born of loneliness. Mara stood there, keys cold in her hand, her pulse roaring in her ears. The story she had rehearsed shattered under the reality of what she had done. The enclosure was no longer abstract. It held a child, a real one. She did not feel powerful. She felt small. And for the first time since the thought began, she understood that some ideas are not meant to be explored, only resisted. But resistance had come too late. The world did not end when the gate closed. That, more than anything, terrified Mara. She had expected something immediate. Sirens, shouting, the universe correcting itself with force. Instead, there was only the faint metallic click of the latch settling into place and the sound of her own breathing, too loud, too fast. For a moment, nothing moved. Lila stood inside the enclosure, her small hands gripping the bars, confusion crossing her face before fear had time to arrive. Children often sense danger not through logic, but through atmosphere, and the air around them had shifted. The safety of wandering freely had vanished, replaced by boundaries she did not understand. Mara, Lila said. Her voice was steady, trusting. That trust landed like a blow. Mara opened her mouth to speak and found no words willing to come out whole. Everything she had rehearsed dissolved. There was no speech prepared for this moment because she had never truly believed she would reach it. "I'll be right back," she finally said, the lie thin and trembling. Even as the words left her mouth, she hated herself for them. Lila nodded, because children nod when adults speak with certainty. She stepped back instinctively, as if making room for an exit that did not exist. Her eyes darted around the enclosure, scanning corners, measuring space, searching for familiar markers. There were none. The kennel had been designed for animals trained to wait, to obey, to endure. It was padded, clean, temperature-controlled. It was not violent. It was not filthy, and that was what made it unforgivable. Mara stumbled backward, her legs unsteady. She told herself she needed help, that she needed to think, that this was temporary and would be corrected in moments. But moments stretched differently under guilt. She stood just outside the structure, her hands pressed to her thighs as if grounding herself. Her heart beat so hard she worried it might draw attention. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of machinery, felt amplified. Inside the enclosure, Lila sat down slowly. She did not cry at first. She waited. Mara watched her through the bars, frozen in a place between action and paralysis. The child's calm unnerved her more than panic would have. It made the situation real in a way screaming could not. "This isn't funny," Lila said after a while, her voice small now. The words shattered whatever fragile illusion Mara had left. "I know," she whispered, though she did not know who she was speaking to. The child, herself, or the part of her that had led her here. Time lost its shape. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt unbearable. Mara's mind raced through possibilities, unlocking the gate immediately, calling security, confessing before the situation escalated. Each option arrived carrying consequences she could no longer avoid. And yet, she remained still. Not because she wanted to, but because moving meant admitting the full weight of what she had done. Regret arrived not as a single emotion, but as a flood. It soaked through her justifications, dissolved her narratives, left nothing standing but fear. Fear of punishment, fear of exposure, fear of herself. Lila began to cry quietly. It was not loud or dramatic. It was the restrained sound of a child trying to be brave when bravery had not been requested. Each soft sob tightened something in Mara's chest until breathing became an effort. "I'm sorry," Mara said, finally, her voice breaking. The apology was meaningless. She knew that. It did not open gates or erase memory. It was only an acknowledgement that the line she had crossed was real and irreversible. She reached for the latch. Her fingers hovered there, trembling. Then voices carried from the house. Security. Someone calling a name. The estate, which had ignored so much, had begun to notice. Panic surged through Mara. Not the sharp kind that motivates action, but the heavy kind that sinks into limbs and slows thought. She imagined herself caught mid-act, the narrative crystallizing around her forever. She let her hand fall. Inside the enclosure, Lila looked up sharply, hope flashing across her face before fading into confusion. "Mara," she asked again, louder now. Mara turned away. She did not walk far, only to the edge of the path, where the structure disappeared behind hedges. She crouched there, her back against the cool stone wall, pressing her fists to her mouth to stifle a sound she did not recognize as her own. The estate erupted into movement. Footsteps, radios crackling, commands exchanged with urgency that had been absent for years. The house, dormant and detached, had finally awakened, not for the woman who cleaned it, but for the child who belonged to it. Mara stayed where she was. She did not flee. Running would have meant clinging to the illusion that she could still escape the consequences. Staying meant something else, something closer to surrender. When the shouting grew closer, when the gate finally opened and the world rushed back into the space she had violated, Mara did not look. She knew what she would see, and she knew that whatever came next, she would never again mistake resentment for justice. The first alarm did not scream. It chimed, a soft, polite sound, designed to alert without alarming, to notify rather than disrupt. It was the kind of sound that assumed control, that trusted someone would handle it quietly. No one did. Within seconds, the chime layered into urgency. Radios crackled. Footsteps multiplied. Doors that were rarely opened slammed with unfamiliar force. The estate, which had lived most of its life in curated stillness, shook itself awake like a startled animal. Lila was lifted from the enclosure by hands that trembled despite their training. A security guard wrapped his jacket around her shoulders. Another crouched to her eye level, speaking softly, carefully, as if volume alone could cause harm. Someone kept repeating, it's okay, not because they believed it, but because silence felt worse. The child did not scream. She clung. Her fingers dug into fabric, into sleeves and collars, holding on to the nearest proof that she was no longer alone. Her eyes stayed wide, absorbing faces that had rarely paused to look at her before. For the first time, everyone was watching. Paramedics arrived even though she was physically unharmed. Protocol demanded it. Cameras flashed from a distance, their lenses hungry for the outline of a scandal they had not yet named. A supervisor barked orders. A lawyer was called before anyone thought to call a parent. Victor Hale was unreachable. His absence pressed into the moment like a second offense. Mara watched from the staff corridor where she had sunk to the floor, her back against the wall, knees drawn to her chest. The world rushed past her now, finally aware of her existence, but not in the way she had imagined during her quieter, more dangerous thoughts. No one asked why she was there. They already knew. Hands grabbed her arms, not roughly, but firmly enough to communicate certainty. Questions came fast, layered over one another, none waiting for answers. Is it locked? Where's the key? How long was she in there? Mara answered some. Others tangled in her throat and never made it out. She did not resist when they pulled her to her feet. Her body felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else who had already accepted what was coming. In the main hall, the marble floor reflected chaos for the first time. Reflections fractured, boots, stretchers, cables, people moving with purpose that felt almost rehearsed. The house had been designed to impress, not to respond. It struggled under the weight of urgency. Lila was carried past Mara without seeing her. That was mercy. Mara's gaze followed the child until the turn of the corridor swallowed her whole. Something inside Mara loosened then, not relief, but release. The moment of waiting was over. The moment of consequences had begun. A senior security officer knelt in front of her, lowering himself to her level. His voice was steady, practiced. Why, he asked. Mara searched for the stories she had told herself. The justifications. The narratives that once felt solid. None of them survived the question. I don't know, she said. It was the first honest thing she had spoken all day. Sirens wailed beyond the gates now, announcing the estate's secret to the outside world. Neighbors gathered at a distance, drawn by instinct and curiosity. Phones rose into the air like offerings, capturing fragments that would soon become certainty. Mara was escorted outside. The sunlight felt wrong. Too bright, too ordinary for what had just occurred. She blinked against it, suddenly aware of how exposed she was. For years, she had blended into walls and routines. Now, every step she took was documented, recorded, interpreted. A reporter shouted a question. She did not hear what it was. Her name was spoken aloud for the first time in the estate grounds. It sounded unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else. She wondered if this was what it felt like to finally be seen, stripped of context, reduced to a single act. Inside the house, professionals worked quickly to restore order. Statements were taken, timelines reconstructed, protocols rewritten in the aftermath of failure. People spoke in hushed tones, not out of respect, but out of fear that they, too, would be blamed. No one spoke of loneliness. No one spoke of absence. They spoke of breaches. Victor Hale arrived hours later, his plane diverted, his expression carved from something harder than shock. He held his daughter tightly, his hands lingering longer than they ever had before. Cameras caught the image and circulated it endlessly. The billionaire father, finally present. Mara watched the footage later, from a holding room with blank walls and no windows. She felt no anger toward him, only a quiet understanding that some awakenings come too late to undo damage. As night fell, the estate lights burned brighter than usual, erasing shadows that had once felt permanent. The house would recover. It always did. Mara would not. When the door closed behind her and the lock slid into place, she did not flinch. She had already crossed the threshold that mattered most. Invisibility had ended, and with it, the illusion that being seen would ever feel like justice. The name came before the facts. It appeared in headlines first, short, sharp, easy to repeat. It traveled faster than nuance ever could, attaching itself to images and assumptions with adhesive certainty. By the time Mara heard it spoken on a television mounted high in a holding room, it no longer felt like hers. She watched strangers say it with confidence. They said it alongside words like monster, caretaker, betrayal. They said it as if a name could carry an entire crime without collapsing under the weight. The story assembled itself in real time, fragments stitched together by urgency rather than accuracy. Every outlet had a version. None of them belonged to her. In the days that followed, Mara was moved through spaces that felt deliberately anonymous. Windowless rooms, hallways that smelled faintly of disinfectant, Chairs bolted to the floor. The world outside roared, but inside, everything was hushed, procedural, restrained. Papers slid across tables. Questions were asked with pens poised, waiting to underline something irreversible. Did you intend to cause harm? No. Did you understand your actions were illegal? Yes. Why the kennel? Mara paused there longer than anywhere else. Because answers demand honesty, and honesty had become expensive. It was there, she said finally. Because it existed. The interviewer's pen hesitated, then continued. There was no space on the page for what she meant. The trial arrived not as a single event, but as a season. Weeks stretched into months as motions were filed and denied, as statements were rehearsed and softened, as the world decided what shape the truth should take. Mara's public defender spoke often, carefully, his words sanded smooth by caution. Do not try to explain too much, he advised. They don't want reasons. They want clarity. Clarity, it turned out, meant simplicity. The prosecution framed the case as an unambiguous violation of trust. A worker abusing access. A child endangered. A line crossed so clearly that context became irrelevant. The jury nodded along, grateful for the relief of certainty. Victor Hale testified once. He wore a dark suit and a controlled expression, the kind honed by boardrooms and negotiations. His voice did not break. His outrage was measured, disciplined. He spoke of security failures, of betrayal, of fear that money could not prevent. When asked about his presence in his daughter's life before the incident, he deflected with practiced ease. My work demands travel, he said. But my love for my daughter has never been in question. No one pressed further. Lila did not testify. That, at least, was mercy. Mara took the stand on the third day. The courtroom felt unreal, wood polished to a shine, flags positioned just so, air thick with anticipation. She felt smaller there than she ever had cleaning penthouses, her body acutely aware of every eye tracking her movements. She answered questions quietly. She did not cry. When asked to explain herself, she chose truth over strategy, even knowing the cost. I felt invisible, she said, and I let that feeling convince me I was right. A murmur rippled through the room. Not sympathy, not outrage, but discomfort. People do not like when motives resemble vulnerabilities they recognize. I wasn't trying to hurt her, Mara continued. But I did. And that matters more than what I wanted. The judge watched her closely then, expression unreadable. Sentencing came weeks later. The courtroom was full again, though the frenzy had dulled. Interest fades when consequences become administrative. Mara stood as the decision was read, her hands steady at her sides. The sentence was firm, but not theatrical. Prison time. Mandatory counseling. A lifetime of being defined by one act. The judge paused before concluding, his voice softer. This court recognizes that harm does not always come from hatred, he said, but it will respond to harm regardless of its source. The gavel fell. Mara did not flinch. Outside, the cameras waited, but she did not look at them. She was thinking of something else. How strange it was that a name could be stripped, reshaped, and returned unrecognizable. How once she had wanted to be seen, and now she would give anything to be ordinary again. As she was led away, someone in the gallery whispered her name. Not kindly, not cruelly, just as a fact. And Mara understood then that names are cages too, built from memory, locked by repetition, and rarely opened once closed. Prison did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers. First came intake, the stripping away of personal items, the inventory of what could not follow her inside. Shoes replaced, clothes exchanged for fabric that carried no history. Hair tied back not for style, but for compliance. Mara moved through the process with a quiet that unsettled even the officers. She did not argue, did not ask for favors, did not cry. Grief had already taken residence in her chest, and it left little room for spectacle. Time changed shape inside. Days were no longer defined by light or errands or the rhythm of work, but by bells and counts and the steady erosion of expectation. Nights were the hardest. Silence there was different from the estate's hush, thicker, more crowded. It pressed against her thoughts, leaving her nowhere to hide from memory. At first, Mara avoided mirrors again. There were fewer of them here, but enough to remind her of the person she was becoming. The woman staring back looked older than she felt, eyes hollowed not by age but by recognition. She had crossed into a life where every future introduction would carry a footnote. She's the one who. The women around her learned her story quickly. Prison is a place where narratives travel faster than names. Some kept their distance. Others studied her with a mix of curiosity and judgment, trying to decide which category she belonged to: threat, cautionary tale, or simply background. Mara worked in the library. It was not assigned out of kindness. It was assigned because she was quiet, reliable, and unlikely to cause disruption. The room smelled of paper and dust and second chances that had been handled too many times. Books lined the walls like witnesses, some hopeful, some indifferent, all patient. There, she learned a different kind of invisibility. Readers came to her with requests, forms to fill out, letters to draft, words they did not know how to spell. Mara helped without commentary, without judgment. She listened more than she spoke. It was the closest she came to purpose, and she accepted it without questioning whether she deserved it. Counseling sessions forced her to revisit the moment she wished she could erase. Again and again, she was asked to describe her thoughts, her feelings, the path that led her there. Each retelling peeled away another layer of excuse until only responsibility remained. "You wanted to be seen," the counselor said once, gently. "Yes," Mara replied. "And when you were, what did you find?" "Consequences." That answer ended the session. Letters arrived early on. Some were hateful, ink pressed hard into paper, words sharpened by distance and certainty. Others were quieter, anonymous, unsure of themselves. People projecting their fears, their judgments, their curiosity. Mara read none of them more than once. One letter came from a woman she did not recognize. It contained only a single sentence: "I don't forgive you, but I hope you learn." Mara kept that one. Beyond the prison walls, the world adjusted. Victor Hale sold assets. He stepped back from public life with the same decisiveness he once brought to expansion. Analysts speculated. Commentators praised his new priorities. He did not speak publicly about his daughter again. Lila grew. Not untouched. No childhood survives fear unmarked, but protected now in ways that had once been assumed unnecessary. Therapy replaced tutors. Presence replaced proxies. The house became smaller, warmer, more human. The kennel was dismantled entirely, its absence leaving a scar in the landscape that no one tried to hide. Mara learned these things slowly, through secondhand whispers and the occasional article left behind in the library. She did not seek them out, but she did not look away either. Consequences, she learned, did not end with sentencing. They echoed. Years passed. Mara aged into routine. She learned which days were easier, which anniversaries demanded extra breath. She stopped dreaming about the estate. When Lila's face appeared in her mind, it came without bars now, only as a reminder of something irretrievable. One afternoon, a new inmate approached the desk, eyes downcast, shame heavy in her posture. "I don't know how to read," she said. Mara slid a book across the table. "Then we'll start with this," she replied. It was not redemption, but it was something that moved in the right direction, and in a place built to measure punishment, that mattered. Time did not heal everything. It softened some edges, dulled others, rearranged the furniture of memory, but it did not erase. What it did instead was leave behind a residue. Lessons that could not be unlearned, silences that could not be filled, questions that would never receive satisfying answers. Lila was 16 when she returned to cages. They were not the kind that closed with a metallic certainty, not the kind that taught fear through confinement. These cages were painted, labeled, softened by volunteers who spoke gently and moved slowly. The animal shelter smelled of disinfectant and damp fur and something hopeful, something that suggested effort mattered even when outcomes were uncertain. Her mother stood a few steps behind her, giving space without absence. That had become the balance they practiced, near enough to protect, far enough to respect. Therapy had taught them both that presence was not a performance, but a discipline. Lila paused in front of one enclosure. Inside, a small dog sat pressed into itself, eyes tracking movement without trust. It did not bark. It did not growl. It waited. Something in Lila's chest tightened, not sharply, but insistently. Memory rose, not as a replay, but as an echo. She remembered the shape of fear more than the place it came from. She remembered how confusion could feel heavier than pain. She knelt. "It's okay," she whispered, voice steady in a way that surprised even her. The dog did not move, but it did not retreat either. Behind her, her mother watched without interrupting. There were moments when protection meant silence. This was one of them. Across the city, in a building constructed to keep people apart from the lives they once lived, Mara closed a book and slid it back onto the shelf. The prison library was quieter in the afternoon, light angling through narrow windows that softened the edges of concrete. She had learned to read the day by sound alone. The shift-change footsteps, the distant doors, the cadence of voices that carried more fatigue than anger now. A woman sat across from her, struggling through a paragraph, finger tracing words slowly. Mara waited, patient. When the woman finally reached the end of the sentence, she looked up, eyes shining with something close to pride. "I did it," she said. Mara nodded. "You did." Did. That was the extent of the celebration. It was enough. Mara no longer counted the years the way she once had. Time inside did not move toward freedom so much as it settled into a shape you learned to live within. She had stopped asking who she might have been. That question led nowhere useful. Instead, she focused on who she could still be, bounded, limited, but not entirely hollow. Some nights, memory returned uninvited. The sound of a latch, the pause before fear, the moment when choice became fact. When that happened, Mara did not fight it. She let the memory pass through her like weather. Resistance had taught her nothing. Acceptance, at least, made room for responsibility. She did not expect forgiveness. She did not seek it. She had learned that some debts are not meant to be paid off, only carried with care. Lila left the shelter with a form in her hand that day. Her mother glanced at it, eyebrows raised. "Thinking about volunteering?" "Maybe," Lila said. Then, after a pause, "I think some things shouldn't be avoided just because they're hard." Her mother smiled, not because the past had disappeared, but because her daughter was learning how to face it without fear dictating the terms. That night, Lila dreamed of open spaces. Not cages, not walls, just movement, just choice. And somewhere in the city, Mara fell asleep at a metal desk, a book open beneath her cheek, dreaming of nothing at all, which, after everything, felt like peace. No story ends cleanly. Some leave scars. Some leave lessons. Some leave both. And sometimes, what remains is not redemption or punishment, but the quiet work of becoming someone who understands the weight of a locked gate and chooses, every day thereafter, not to close one again.